I am Captain Faith Diaz, 32 years old. 5 years ago, I called the police to report my own brother. Since then, my family hasn't spoken a word to me. My mother called me a traitor. My father claimed he no longer had a daughter. My own sister Paige branded me a disgusting liar on Facebook for the whole town of Millbrook to see. I was exiled, scrubbed from the group chats, barred from every Thanksgiving and Christmas at the house on Maple Ridge. For 5 straight years, I stood on the front lines alone. But there's one thing those hypocrites didn't count on: I wasn't the only one. There were 7 other girls. 7 blood relatives, all biting their tongues, carrying the weight of a brutal secret. What happened in that courtroom changed everything. But first, let me take you back to the beginning. Welcome back to Noble Revenge, where families who choose silence learn that the truth has its own timeline. If you're new here, stay tuned. You're definitely gonna want to know how this ends. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out. Now, let's get into it. 5 years ago, ground zero. November in Millbrook always tasted like wood smoke and damp leaves. But inside the house on Maple Ridge, it smelled like cheap floral perfume and heavy grease. It was Thanksgiving dinner, the kind of tradition that's supposed to be sacred in a town like this. I sat at the far corner of the long oak table, wearing a plain gray wool sweater that felt like a lead vest. I was a ghost at my own family's feast, a ghost who had spent too many years overseas and no longer knew how to play the part of the dutiful daughter. Travis sat at the center, the undisputed king of the mountain. He looked like the poster boy for American grit flannel shirt, thick shoulders, and a smile that convinced every neighbor he was the hardest working man in the county. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a slip of paper with a deliberate, slow movement. A check. He slid it across the wood toward our father, his eyes tracking the movement with a smug, quiet power. 2,400 pop. Travis said, his voice a low, self-assured rasp that made my skin crawl. Covers the mortgage for the month, plus a little extra for Ma's oil bill. Consider it my contribution to keeping the lights on. Gerald didn't say a word. He looked at that check like it was a holy relic delivered by an angel. He tucked it into his shirt pocket with trembling fingers, looking at Travis with the eyes of a starving man who had finally found a savior. Beside him, Diane didn't even look at the turkey. She carved the best piece of white meat, the tenderest cut of the breast, and placed it on Travis's plate with a devotion that turned my stomach. She didn't even look my way. To her, I was just an expense. Travis was the investment. I watched Travis's hands as he picked up his fork. I saw the black grease under his fingernails stained deep into the cuticles, a permanent mark of the workshop. In this town, that dirt was supposed to be a badge of honesty. To me, it looked like black rot. The rule in this house was unspoken but absolute: the one who pays the bills writes the laws. And tonight, Travis owned the judge, the jury, and the executioner. The air was heavy like the static pressure before a massive flash flood. I couldn't breathe in that room anymore. I stood up, my boots heavy on the linoleum floor, as I headed toward the kitchen to grab the pie. No one noticed. No one cared. I was just the daughter who went to war and came back with a stare that made them uncomfortable. I was halfway to the pantry when the sound stopped me dead. It was a jagged, wet sob coming from the hallway. I pressed my shoulder against the cold drywall, my pulse steadying into that sharp military focus I'd learned in the desert. I stayed in the shadows. I heard Megan, my 17-year-old niece, weeping into her hands. Then came Paige's voice, my own sister. It wasn't soft or comforting. It was a hiss that cut through the drywall like a serrated blade. "Don't make a scene, Megan." Paige ranted, her voice tight with a desperate, ugly kind of fear. "Just don't go into the garage when he's working. Just don't be alone with him anymore. It ain't that hard. Do you want to lose this house? You want to see your grandma on the street because you couldn't keep your mouth shut? He's the only reason we aren't bankrupt." I felt the kitchen knife in my hand, the one meant for the pumpkin pie, grow incredibly heavy. My internal threat assessment didn't just blink. It turned into a full-blown siren. We had an insurgent in the wire, a predator in the nursery, and my own sister was protecting him because he paid the mortgage. 10 minutes later, I walked out the back door without a word. The November air hit my face like a physical slap, cold and honest. I found Megan huddled on the concrete steps of the back porch. She was shaking so hard, her teeth were chattering, her thin arms wrapped around her knees as if trying to hold herself together. She didn't have a coat. I didn't hug her. I didn't cry. In the field, you don't comfort a casualty until the perimeter is secure. I knelt down on the cold, rough concrete, keeping a respectful distance. I locked my eyes onto hers and waited for her to see me. "Megan," I said, my voice a flat iron line. "Report to me, right now." She looked up and for a second she didn't see her aunt. She saw the captain. She saw someone who knew how to handle a crisis. That's exactly what she needed. She started talking, the words coming out in a rush of bile, shame, and terror. She told me what happened in that workshop. She told me how he threatened her, how he used the family's poverty as a leash. Every sentence stripped the saint of Millbrook naked. By the time she was done, the grease under Travis's fingernails made perfect sense. It wasn't just motor oil. It was the grime of a predator who thought he was untouchable. I didn't say another word to her. I walked to my truck. I sat in the dark cab for 40 minutes. I didn't start the engine. The only light came from a dim yellow street lamp reflecting off the dashboard. I reached up and adjusted the red wool scarf around my neck, the one my grandmother gave me before she died. It was the only thing in this family that didn't feel like it was for sale. My hands were steady, as cold as the glass of the windshield. I pulled out my phone and dialed the number for the Dutchess County Sheriff's Office. "Sheriff's Office, Detective Walsh," a voice answered. "This is Captain Faith Diaz," I said. I spoke with the clarity of a soldier reading coordinates for an airstrike. "I need to report a felony, aggravated sexual assault. The suspect is at 14 Maple Ridge. He's there right now." The typing on the other end stopped instantly. There was a long, heavy silence. I could hear Walsh's intake of breath. "Captain," she said, her voice dropping an octave into a warning. "You understand what this is gonna do, right? You pull this trigger and your family's gonna tear you to pieces. You're gonna be the villain in their story for the rest of your life. Are you sure about this?" I gripped the steering wheel, looking at the dark silhouette of the house where Travis was currently laughing and drinking my father's beer. I thought about Megan's hollow eyes. I thought about the $2,400 check in Gerald's pocket. "I'm sure," I said. I ended the call. The silence in the truck was total. I turned the key and the engine roared to life. I didn't go back inside for my pie. I didn't say goodbye to anyone. I just drove. The war had started, and I was the one who pulled the pin. The sun didn't just rise the next morning. It hauled itself over the horizon like a witness to a crime. In Millbrook, secrets don't stay buried once the sirens start. By 8 a.m., the blue and red lights were already bouncing off the rusted tin roof of Brooks & Sons. I wasn't there to see Travis get cuffed, but I could hear it. I could hear every rumor, every whisper traveling through the phone lines of the county like a fever. Travis was led out of his shop in zip ties, his face a mask of wounded pride. He didn't look like a man caught. He looked like a king being betrayed. By 9 p.m., I was 3 hours into my night shift at the base clinic. The world inside the wire was different. Everything was sterile white and smelled of industrial-grade bleach and rubbing alcohol. My desert camouflaged uniform was starched, the creases sharp enough to cut. I stood at the nursing station, my spine a straight line, my eyes scanning the monitors with the kind of focus that keeps you alive in a combat zone. Out here, I was Captain Diaz, a healer, a leader. But I could feel the siege lines closing in from Millbrook. The vibration started while I was in the staff bathroom, prepping to wash the scent of the clinic off my hands. My phone didn't just ring. It danced a frantic, jagged rhythm on the porcelain lid of the toilet tank. Buzz, buzz, buzz. The caller ID flashed a name I'd known my whole life, Diane. I stared at the screen for 3 full pulses before I picked it up. I didn't get a chance to breathe, let alone say a word. "You're destroying this family, Faith." She spat, her voice coming through the speaker like a handful of gravel. I leaned my back against the cold white subway tiles. The chill seeped through my uniform. "I'm protecting Megan, Ma. I told you what he did. I told you what she said." "Megan is a confused 17-year-old girl who doesn't know what's good for her," Diane shrieked. The sound was raw, stripped of any motherly warmth. "But Travis is the man who kept the roof over our heads. He's the one who walked into that kitchen every single month and put a check for $2,400 on the table. That money paid the mortgage. It kept the bank from taking your father's pride. What do you think happens to us when you take him away?" I closed my eyes. I thought about the 12 years I spent in school and the 5 years I spent overseas patching up men who had been blown apart by IEDs. I'd sent every spare cent home for years, but in that bathroom, I realized I was being weighed on a scale I couldn't win. To my mother, my honor didn't have a dollar sign on it. I was lighter than a mortgage payment. I was worth less than $2,400. Travis does everything for this house. Diane's voice dropped into a hiss. And you come home for one dinner and burn the whole thing down. You call that detective right now. Tell her it was a mistake. Tell her Megan was lying for attention. Fix it, Faith. Or don't you ever think about showing your face here for Christmas. We don't want a traitor at the table. I looked at my reflection in the mirror. The fluorescent light overhead flickered a harsh, buzzing hum that made my teeth ache. I looked at the black and gold Diaz name tape pinned over my heart. It was a name I used to be proud of. I can't do that, I said. My voice didn't shake. It was a flat, dead sound. The line went dead with a sharp click. I walked out of the bathroom and into the locker room, my boots echoing against the concrete. The air felt thin. I opened my locker, reaching for my water bottle when the phone lit up again. Gerald, my father. This was the man who had walked me into the church every Sunday since I could walk. He was the man who taught me that the truth was the only path to God. I picked up the phone, a small foolish part of me, hoping for a shred of justice. I wanted him to tell me he was proud of me for standing up for Megan. Dad, I whispered. Faith, he said. His voice was hollow, like he was speaking from the bottom of a well. I've spent 32 years thinking I raised a daughter who understood the meaning of blood. But a daughter of mine would never do this. A daughter of mine wouldn't put her own brother in a cage over a girl's whim. A whim, Dad? She was crying. She was terrified. I don't know who you are, he replied, and I could hear the finality in his breath. But you aren't my girl anymore. My daughter is gone. He didn't wait for a reply. He didn't give me a chance to argue. He just cut the line. 32 years of history of birthdays, of fishing trips, and of Sunday sermons, all wiped out with the press of a red button. I was officially an army of one. I sat there on that cold bench in the locker room, the hum of the bass machines, the only thing keeping me company. It's a hell of a thing to realize your family puts a price tag on your soul and finds it lacking. If you've ever been the one to stand up and tell the truth, even when it meant standing alone, hit that like button right now. I need to know there are other soldiers out there in this fight with me. Do me a favor and drop a stay strong in the comments if you're riding with me. Let's show them that the truth doesn't have a price tag. I stood up, my jaw set so tight it felt like it might snap. I shoved my phone into the dark corner of my locker and slammed the steel door shut. The sound rang through the empty room, a sharp metallic bang that sounded exactly like a cell door locking into place. I turned the dial, sealing my old life away. I didn't have a family anymore. I had a mission. The case didn't just die, it was smothered. Megan folded within 48 hours. In a town where water is thin and gossip is thick, a 17-year-old girl is no match for a mother screaming about mortgage payments and a town that protects its own. Megan retracted everything, claiming she was just confused and emotional. The sheriff's office closed the file. Travis didn't just walk free. He was escorted back to his throne by the cheers of the local elite. The Saint of Millbrook was back in his grease-stained glory, and I was just the ghost who tried to haunt him. The digital stoning began on a Friday night. My phone sat on my kitchen table, vibrating with a jagged, frantic rhythm that sounded like a warning. Paige didn't just post a status, she issued a proclamation of war. I stared at the blue light of the screen, the glare casting a ghostly pallor on the walls. Some people are so consumed by jealousy they'll invent the most vile stories to tear down their own blood. Absolutely tragic. Total trash. 231 likes by midnight. Right at the top, a red heart emoji from Diane Brooks. My mother didn't just offer support, she loved the public execution of my character. The red heart was a betrayal I couldn't unsee. I didn't type a rebuttal. I just pressed the power button and sat alone in the dark. I made one last mistake. Paige's birthday. I wanted to believe there was a bridge left to cross. I bought a thin gold chain, boxed it, and sent it through the mail. 2 weeks later, it was back on my porch. The cardboard was damp from the afternoon dew. The packing tape was perfectly intact. They hadn't even cut it open. They didn't want the gold. And they certainly didn't want the sister who came with it. They returned it like it was a biohazard, a piece of contaminated evidence they didn't want in their house. I picked up the box, felt the small, useless weight of it, and dropped it into the dumpster behind the building. I didn't look back to see it land among the trash. The mission in Millbrook had failed completely. I didn't want to breathe the same air as Travis or see Diane in the grocery store anymore. I went to my commanding officer the next morning and requested a PCS, a permanent change of station. I told them I was ready for the vacancy at the medical wing in Albany, 3 hours north, far enough that the name Brooks wouldn't trigger a sneer from the person behind the counter. The papers were signed by noon. Packing took less than 4 hours. I had 3 heavy-duty cardboard boxes and 2 military bags. I used a tape gun, the zzz sound of the brown tape echoing like a gunshot in the empty room. I used old PT shirts to wrap my plates and my 1 coffee mug. I folded my scrubs with the sharp extreme edges I'd learned in basic training. I stacked my medical degree, the heavy paper Gerald and Diane never bothered to see me receive, at the very bottom of the second box. It was the foundation of my career, buried under the weight of my reality. I saved the red wool scarf for last. It was the only thing I owned that smelled like my grandmother instead of the clinic. I placed it on top, a single splash of color in a life turned gray. The morning I left Millbrook was buried under a heavy, suffocating drizzle. I didn't do a final walkthrough of the apartment. I stood in the small entryway for a second, and the scent of dust and floor cleaner sharpened my nose. I pulled the door shut, heard the deadbolt click, and walked down to the landlord's office. I threw the key onto his desk without a word. He started to talk about the security deposit, but I was already out the door. The route to the highway ran straight past Brooks & Sons. I couldn't avoid it. The shop was glowing under a neon sign that hummed in the damp air. Travis was there, standing in the open bay of the garage. He was leaning against a black truck holding a cup of coffee. He was laughing with his mechanics, his head tossed back, his throat exposed to the rain. He looked like a man who owned the world. He looked like he'd won the lottery instead of getting away with a crime. He didn't see me drive by. I didn't tap the brakes. I gripped the steering wheel with everything I had, my knuckles bone white against the leather. I followed the white lines of the road onto the I-87 on-ramp, the tires grinding onto the wet asphalt with a low, predatory growl. 3 hours to Albany. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't want a soundtrack for my exile. I just wanted the hum of the engine and the rhythmic slap of the wipers. I merged onto the highway and adjusted the red scarf against my cold skin. And then I did the most important thing I've ever done. I didn't look at the rearview mirror, not once. I didn't want to see the town shrinking into the rain. I had already sealed that part of my life. I was driving into the cold, clean air of the north, and I wasn't bringing any ghosts with me. 5 years is a long time to keep your back to the wind. In Albany, the wind is a razor that cuts through your coat and reminds you that you're alive. I liked it that way. I liked the cold. It was honest. The city of Albany doesn't care about your soul. It's a city of concrete gray skies and people moving too fast to ask where you came from. I fit right in. For 5 years, I didn't just live, I executed a plan. I filled the hollow space where my family used to be with the cold, hard weight of a schedule. 12-hour shifts at the base clinic. 4 a.m. runs when the air was so sharp it felt like inhaling needles. I didn't run for the cardio. I ran to outpace the ghosts of Maple Ridge. The treadmill in the base gym became my church. Beep, beep, beep. The rhythm of the machine was the only heartbeat I trusted. I used military discipline like mortar, filling the cracks Gerald and Diane had left in my foundation. I made Millbrook a dead zone. No calls, no letters. I changed my number. I blocked the socials. I was a ghost who had finally found a grave she liked. I was financially independent. No checks for $2,400, no price tags on my loyalty. If I couldn't buy my way back into their hearts, I sure as hell wasn't going to let them rent space in my head. The military makes you talk to people like Dr. Lindgren. Sallow skin, a soft voice, and a room that smelled like old paper and lemon furniture polish. I sat on the edge of the leather chair, my back a steel rod. I didn't offer emotions. I gave him facts. I reported the case, the retraction, the digital stoning, and the exile. I laid it out like a casualty report. Lindgren didn't look away. He tapped a cheap plastic pen against his desk, a rhythmic, annoying sound. "Faith," he said, "you think you broke that house when you called the cops. You didn't." I stared at him, my jaw tight. "Families like yours are like old bridges," he continued, rusted, shaking, held together by nothing but silence and lies. "You didn't break it by telling the truth. Their silence is what shattered it. You just turned the lights on and showed them the wreckage." That was the first time I felt the weight in my chest shift. It wasn't my fault. Year 3. Winter. The kind of cold that turns the Hudson River into a sheet of iron. Marcus Diaz walked into the clinic with a jagged tear in his left forearm. A construction accident. A piece of rebar had snapped and bitten deep into the muscle. He didn't scream. He didn't curse. He just sat on the exam table, his face pale, but his eyes steady. I prepped the kit. The smell of antiseptic was heavy in the air. "This is gonna sting," I said. "I've had worse," he replied. I stitched him up. 3 neat, perfect sutures. I liked his silence. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of Millbrook. It was the quiet of a man who didn't need to perform. A few weeks later, we were at a diner, the smell of burnt coffee and grease hanging over us. I didn't play games. I didn't do the getting to know you dance. I laid my deck on the table. I told him about Travis. I told him about the mortgage check Diane loved more than me. I told him about the gift box they sent back unopened. I waited for the look, the pity, the "maybe you should call them" speech. Marcus just chewed his burger, swallowed, and looked me in the eye. "You did right," he said. That was it. 3 words. No judgment, no lecture. He didn't ask me to be a bigger person. He just acknowledged the truth. We got married in a courthouse. No white dress. No Diane crying fake tears in the front row. Just us and the clerk. I took his name, Diaz. It felt like putting on a new set of armor. We bought a red brick house in Del Mar. It's 3 hours from Millbrook, but it feels like a different planet. There are no neon signs for Brooks and Sons here, just a quiet street and a yard with an old oak tree. I stood in the kitchen on a Tuesday night, the weight of the gold band on my finger feeling solid. Real. Marcus was in the living room, the sound of his boots on the hardwood a constant. Comforting rhythm. Then came Lily. She has Marcus's eyes and my stubborn chin. When I hold her, I feel a different kind of fear. Not the fear of being hit or hated, but the fear of the cycle. I look at her and I make a vow every single night. This house won't be built on silence. There will be no price tags here. No one gets sold out for a mortgage payment. The Del Mar house is a fortress. The brick is thick. The locks are heavy. I built a life where the rules are simple. We tell the truth, we protect each other, and we never look back. I haven't heard a word from Millbrook in years. To them, I am dead. To me, they are just a bad dream I finally woke up from. I stood by the window, watching the moonlight hit the snow. The house was silent. But it was a good silence, a safe one. I was 32, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. I wasn't looking for insurgents in the shadows. I checked the deadbolt one last time. I kissed Lily's warm forehead. I went to bed. I was safe. But deep down in the marrow of my bones, I knew that the truth didn't just stay buried. It was out there festering in the dark mud of Millbrook, waiting for a shovel, waiting for a spark to light the fuse I'd left behind 5 years ago. August in Del Mar is a slow, suffocating kind of heat. The air doesn't just sit on you, it chokes you. I stood in the kitchen, the sharp scent of sterilized plastic and baby formula filling the room. Lily was 3 months old, a small, warm weight of hope in a life that usually felt like cold concrete. I was shaking a bottle, the rhythmic thump slosh of the milk hitting the glass the only sound in the house until Marcus walked in. He wasn't wearing his work boots. He looked at me with a heavy sort of hesitation and handed me a brown A4 envelope. There was no return address. Just a Scranton postmark and a slanted, nervous handwriting I hadn't seen in half a decade. Aunt Linda. I didn't wait. I grabbed a paring knife from the butcher block and slid a clean, jagged line across the top. The paper was rough against my thumbs. I pulled out 2 handwritten pages and 8 sheets of printed paper. They were screenshots. Dozens of iMessage bubbles frozen in time. I felt the air leave my lungs as I scanned the first page. It was a text Diane had sent to the family group chat the week I moved to Albany. "She's dead to me now," my mother had written. "If anyone mentions her name in this house again, consider yourself gone too. We protect our own. We don't harbor traitors." I felt my spine go rigid, that old military steel clicking back into place. But it was the fourth page that turned my blood into ice water. It was a private message Diane had sent to Linda 3 years ago. Linda had reached out asking if they should finally tell me the truth. Diane's reply was a cold, calculated threat. "Linda, keep your mouth shut. If you even think about calling Faith, you'll be the next one out on the street. I made this choice for the family 12 years ago, and I'm not letting that girl ruin it now. 12 years. The number burned my eyes. I didn't say a word to Marcus. I took the papers, walked into the master bathroom, and locked the door. I didn't turn on the light. I sat on the edge of the tub, the cold porcelain biting through my leggings. I dialed Linda's number. She picked up on the first ring, her voice thin and shaking like a leaf in a storm. The call lasted 47 minutes. 47 minutes of watching my past turn to ash. Linda didn't hold back anymore. She told me about the cousin who came forward 12 years ago. She told me how she went to Diane, terrified, telling her what Travis had done. And she told me Diane's response. My mother hadn't cried. She hadn't screamed. She had looked Linda in the eye and said, "You heard wrong. We aren't going to mention this again. Travis is going to take over the shop and we need him. Forget it happened." Diane wasn't a victim of Travis's lies. She was the architect of his protection. She had spent over a decade watching him walk into rooms with young girls, knowing exactly what kind of monster she was feeding. She didn't throw me out because she believed I was a liar. She threw me out because I was the only one she couldn't control. She traded my life, Megan's life, and 7 other girls' lives for a mortgage payment and the Brooks name on a garage sign. I hung up the phone and leaned my head against the cold tile wall. The blue light from the screen cast a ghostly, sickly pallor over my hands. I wasn't just angry. I was a different kind of empty. I stood up and pulled open the bottom drawer of the vanity. Hidden under a stack of towels was the red wool scarf from Millbrook. I pulled it out, the fabric coarse and smelling of old dust. I didn't put it around my neck. I wrapped it tight around my right fist, pulling it so hard the wool bit into my knuckles. I sat down on the floor, my back against the tub, and I finally let it out. I didn't cry for my mother. I didn't cry because I missed home. I cried for the 27-year-old girl I used to be. The girl who thought if she just explained it clearly enough, her mother would choose the truth. I cried for the 5 years I spent wondering what I had done wrong. The tears were hot, jagged things that left my throat raw. It was a funeral rite. I was burying the daughter Diane thought she had broken. I was burying the idea that blood meant anything in a house built on bone and silence. When the sobbing stopped, the silence that followed was absolute. I stood up and looked in the mirror. My eyes were bloodshot. My face was pale, but my jaw was a locked gate. I unwrapped the red scarf from my hand, the fabric holding the shape of my clenched fist. Diane had spent 12 years protecting a monster. She had spent 72 hours destroying me to keep her secret safe. She thought she had won because I was 3 hours away and silent. She thought the $2,400 check was the end of the story. She was wrong. I walked out of the bathroom, past the nursery where Lily was sleeping, and into the kitchen. Marcus was standing by the counter, his face a map of worry. I didn't say anything to him. I picked up my phone and opened my contacts. I scrolled past the blocked numbers, past the dead ends of my old life, until I found the name I'd saved 5 years ago and never touched. Detective Aaron Walsh. I looked at the red scarf sitting on the kitchen table. It wasn't a memory anymore. It was a flag. I tapped the number. "Detective Walsh," the voice answered on the third ring. "Who is this?" I gripped the edge of the granite counter, my voice coming out like a whetted blade. "This is Captain Faith Diaz," I said. "5 years ago you told me to call you if anything changed. Well, it just did. I have the receipts. And this time, I'm not just reporting a brother. I'm taking down the woman who helped him do it." The walls in Millbrook began to rot from the inside out long before I ever left. Megan was 22 now, a senior in college studying psychology, a degree she chose to make sense of the madness she survived. She was cleaning out the attic at Maple Ridge, dodging cobwebs and the smell of mothballs when she found a manila folder tucked behind a mountain of old Sears catalogs. Inside was a copy of the police report I'd filed 5 years ago. She saw my signature, Captain Faith Diaz, written in that sharp, unwavering black ink. In that moment, the years of gaslighting Diane had fetter vanished. Megan wasn't crazy. She wasn't a liar. I hadn't abandoned her. I'd been exiled for trying to save her from a monster. She picked up her phone, her hands finally steady, and dialed Detective Aaron Walsh. Tuesday morning, March. The air in Delmar was still biting a lingering winter that refused to let go of the grass. I was in the kitchen watching the blue light flicker on the bottle warmer. My phone buzzed on the granite counter, the screen lighting up with that Dutchess County area code. I didn't recognize the number, but my pulse spiked like a tripwire. I picked it up. Captain Diaz, the voice said. It was a rasp I hadn't heard in 5 years. It was the sound of iron hitting gravel in a dark alley. Detective Walsh, I replied, my voice a flat professional line. I told you I'd call if the weather changed, Faith, Walsh said. The storm just hit Millbrook. The situation has shifted. Megan came in. She gave us names we never had before. My throat felt like dry sand under a noon sun. Names. Walsh didn't sugarcoat it. She read the list like a casualty report after a night raid. Megan, Bethany, Sarah. A cousin you haven't seen in a decade. 7 in total, Faith. 7 girls, all between 12 and 18 when it happened. 7. I leaned my forehead against the cool vibrating glass of the kitchen window. I thought about the dinners I'd missed. I thought about the $2,400 mortgage payments Diane had prioritized over blood. 7 childhoods traded for a garage and a reputation. The grand jury is being convened, Walsh said. That report you filed 5 years ago, it was ground zero. It's the only reason these girls felt safe enough to step into the light. Without your report, we wouldn't have the standing to open this wide. You gave them the perimeter they finally needed. I closed my eyes, the weight of it pressing down on my shoulders like a heavy rucksack. I had spent 5 years thinking I was a failure. But the truth didn't die. It just went into hibernation under the snow. That evening, I sat at the table in Delmar. The folder was open. I looked at the photos of the workshop, the grease-stained walls where Travis had reigned. Marcus came up behind me, his hands resting on my shoulders. He didn't offer empty platitudes, he just squeezed his presence a grounding force. You were 27 years old. Marcus said, his voice steady. The whole town was hunting you. Your own mother was leading the charge. You did more than any person in that house could have done. You stood the line alone. I left them there, Marcus, I whispered. I left them in the dark. No, he replied. You didn't leave them. You went to find reinforcements. And now, they've arrived. 2 days later, the doorbell rang. It was a sharp, intrusive sound. I walked to the door, my spine straight like I was at attention. A man in a suit stood on the porch holding a sealed white envelope. He handed it over and walked back to his car. The paper inside was heavy. It was a subpoena from the Dutchess County Court, a formal command to appear as a witness. This wasn't a request for help. This was a deployment order for the final war. I looked at the gold ring on my finger, then at the envelope in my hand. The 5 years of silence were over. The exile was done. I wasn't just a captain anymore. I was a witness for the 7 lives Diane had tried to erase. I stood there in the entryway, the weight of that envelope feeling heavier than any weapon I'd ever carried. 7 names, 7 reasons to never look back. Sometimes the only way to heal a wound is to cut deep and let the poison out, even if it means burning the whole house down. If you've ever had to be the ground zero for your own family's truth, let me know in the comments. I walked into the kitchen and picked up my car keys. I didn't need to pack a bag. I was already ready. I looked at Marcus, and he nodded. I opened my phone and sent a 1-word text to Walsh. Accepted. The war hadn't ended 5 years ago. It had just been waiting for the reinforcements to arrive, and now the front lines were moving back to Millbrook. I checked the lock on the door one last time. I was going home. Not to be a daughter, not to seek forgiveness. I was going back to finish what I started. 7 voices, 1 truth, 0 doubt, 0 fear. Millbrook didn't just gossip after the indictment, it burned. Travis was looking at 11 counts 11, and the town's golden boy was suddenly a pariah with a mugshot on the front page of every local paper. The local power brokers who'd spent years slapping him on the back were suddenly nowhere to be found. But the Brooks family didn't have a surrender in them. They didn't know how to repent, only how to manipulate. They went into full self-destruct mode, pulling every lever of guilt and shame they had left in their arsenal. The first strike came at 2 a.m. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, the vibration a low predatory hum against the wood. Gerald. My father's voice was slurry, thick with the kind of cheap bourbon and cowardice that had defined his life. He didn't ask about Lily. He didn't ask how I was doing after 5 years of silence. He just whined. "Faith, honey, you gotta listen." He said his words muddy and desperate. "Tell the DA you got it wrong. Tell them you were just pissed off about the house money. Say it was a grudge. Just save your brother, Faith. He's all we got left. Don't do this to us." I sat up in bed, the cold air of the room hitting my bare shoulders. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I just held the phone away from my ear, looking at it like it was a piece of contaminated medical waste. "It ain't just me anymore, Dad." I said, my voice as flat as a heart monitor in a morgue. "There's 7 other girls. 7, and they aren't making it up." "You're a liar." He spat, the pity vanishing and the venom taking its place. I didn't answer. I just tapped the screen, blocked. I rolled over and stared at the dark ceiling, my jaw so tight it felt like the bone might crack. Next came Paige. She'd moved on from public Facebook posts to direct digital fire. My screen was a constant stream of jagged, hateful pings. "You're gonna regret this. You're dragging our name through the mud just to feel big in that uniform. Ma is dying because of you." I didn't engage. I didn't type a single word back. In the military, you don't argue with a wounded insurgent. You just document the threat. I spent my lunch break at the clinic taking screenshots. One by one, I forwarded every threat, every manipulation to Detective Walsh and the DA. No gray areas. Every word Paige sent was just another nail I was handing to the prosecution. Then, 3 weeks before the trial, the war moved to my front door. I was in the driveway loading a bag of groceries into the house when I heard it. The crunch of tires on gravel. A black SUV I hadn't seen in years pulled in, the wheel wells rusted and the engine idling with a rough, uneven throb. Diane Brooks climbed out. She'd driven 3 hours from Millbrook just to throw one last punch. I stood my ground at the top of the porch steps. My arms crossed over my chest, my feet planted shoulder-width apart. I was the captain now, not the daughter. "Faith," she said, her voice cracking as she approached. She looked older, smaller, but the eyes were still the same, calculating and cold. She smelled like stale peppermint candy, and the kind of desperation that turns people into monsters. She started to cry, those fake practice tears she used whenever the mortgage was late, or she wanted Gerald to shut up. "I'm your mother, Faith," she whimpered, reaching out with a hand that I didn't take. "How can you be so cruel? How can you do this to your own brother? He's family. Blood. Don't do this to him." I looked at her. My eyes locked onto hers, unblinking. I didn't feel a shred of pity. I just felt a deep, oily sense of disgust. 7 girls, Diane, I said. 7, you knew. You've always known. The mask didn't just slip, it shattered. She stopped crying instantly, her face hardening into something sharp and jagged. She lunged forward and grabbed my wrist, her fingernails digging into my skin. "If you walk into that courtroom," she hissed, her breath hot against my face, "I will never forgive you. You hear me? Never. You'll be dead to this family for good." I didn't flinch. I didn't pull my arm away. I just leaned in closer until our noses were almost touching. "It's been 5 years, Diane," I said, my voice a whetted blade. "You already told the whole town I was dead. You already stopped forgiving me the second I refused to lie for your paycheck. So what's one more thing?" Diane recoiled like I'd slapped her. She let go of my arm, her hand shaking as she smoothed her hair back. She looked at me with a hatred so pure it was almost impressive. She didn't say another word. She just turned around her heels, clicking sharply on the porch steps, and marched back to her SUV. She threw the car into reverse tires, spinning, throwing gravel across my lawn as she roared out of the driveway. I stood there and watched the dust settle. The negotiations were over. The bridges weren't just burned, I'd bombed the foundations. I walked inside, closed the door, and checked the deadbolt. My jaw was still tight, the phantom smell of stale peppermint lingering in the air. I went to the kitchen, picked up the subpoena sitting on the counter, and tucked it into my bag. The negotiations were done. The next time I saw Diane Brooks, it would be across a crowded courtroom, and she wouldn't be the one holding the gavel. I checked my watch. Time to move out, October 14th. The Dutchess County Courthouse didn't feel like a temple of justice. It felt like a meat locker. Cold, static, heavy with the smell of old oak floor wax and the sour, sharp scent of nervous sweat. I sat on the left side of the room, my dress blues starched so stiff they could stand up on their own. Marcus sat next to me, his hand a solid, warm weight against the chill of the room. Across the aisle, the Brooks family sat like a row of cracked statues. Travis wasn't the king of Millbrook anymore. He sat in a cheap, pale blue button-down that made his skin look sallow, his eyes glued to the scuffed linoleum floor. No smirk, no grease-stained arrogance, just a man waiting for the floor to drop. When they called my name, I stood up. I didn't rush. I walked to the stand, my heels clicking against the wood with the rhythmic precision of a ticking clock. I placed my hand on the Bible, but I looked at the jury. 12 regular people with mortgages and kids of their own. I didn't give them a performance. I gave them a triage report. I read the dates, the times, the physical evidence I'd seen on Megan 5 years ago. My voice was a flat surgical line devoid of the hollow drama the family had tried to paint me with. The defense attorney, a guy in a $1,000 suit who'd never worked a day under a car hood, tried to bait me. He leaned in close, his breath smelling like peppermint and expensive arrogance. Isn't it true, Captain Diaz, that you're only here because you were cut out of the family, because of a dispute over a $2,400 mortgage payment? I didn't blink. I didn't let the anger reach my hands. I just scanned the room, my eyes locking onto his for a beat too long. I am a medical officer in the United States Army. I said the words coming out like wetted stone. My duty is to report injuries, not to nurse a grudge. I saw a wound. I reported it. The only dispute here is why it took 5 years for anyone to care. The day didn't stop with me. One by one, the other girls walked to that stand. Bethany and Sarah. Names I'd only seen on a list in an envelope from Scranton. Each one was a nail. Each testimony was a hammer blow against the foundation of Maple Ridge. Detective Walsh sat in the front row, holding that yellow ledger like a weapon. She'd spent 5 years collecting these voices, waiting for my ground zero report to make them legal. By 2 p.m., the air in the room was so thick it was hard to swallow. Diane Brooks couldn't take the silence anymore. She didn't just stand, she erupted from the gallery, her face a mask of jagged fury. "Liars!" she shrieked, her voice echoing off the high ceiling like a gunshot. "All of you. My son is a good boy. He took care of this town. He paid the bills when none of you could." The judge's gavel hit the bench with a sharp, piercing sound. "Sit down, Mrs. Brooks, or you'll be removed from this court." Diane collapsed into her seat, her breath coming in ragged, ugly hitches. She leaned over and whispered loud enough for the front row to hear, "I only did what was best for this family. I protected us." It was the most honest, disgusting thing she had ever said. She had traded blood for a garage sign and thought she was a martyr. Then the prosecution called the final witness, the 7th name. The double doors at the back of the room swung open. Paige Brooks walked in. The sister who had called me trash on Facebook. The one who had told me I'd regret dragging the family through the mud. She wasn't wearing her mask of hate today. Her face was raw, her eyes red and swollen. Her posture hunched as if she were carrying the weight of the entire building. She didn't look at Travis. She didn't look at Diane. She walked straight to the stand, her knuckles white as she gripped the microphone. "I'm here to tell the truth." Paige said, her voice cracking a thin, shattered sound that filled every corner of that wood-paneled room. "I believe Faith. I believe everything she said." A sharp, hollow gasp came from Diane's throat. Paige looked at the jury, tears finally spilling over. "I called my sister a liar for 5 years. I attacked her. I hated her. But I only did it because if she was telling the truth, then I'd have to admit what happened to me too." In that same garage, 12 years ago, while my mother sat in the kitchen and ignored the screaming. The air left the room. Travis put his head in his hands. Gerald looked like he was about to vomit. Diane sat there, her mouth open, finally realizing that the family she had sold her soul to protect had never actually existed. It was just a house of mirrors, and the mirrors had all just shattered. I felt my starched collar suddenly feel too tight. My military composure, the shield I'd worn for 5 years, finally began to crack. I looked at Paige, the sister I'd hated, the one who had been the 7th casualty all along. Under the table, Marcus found my hand and squeezed it. The judge looked at the jury, his face like stone. "The court will recess while the jury deliberates," he said. He stood up and walked out. No one else moved. We all sat in that cold, oak-heavy room, waiting for the world to decide what a Brooks' life was actually worth. The truth was out. The bill had finally come due. And this time, a $2,400 check wasn't going to be enough to cover the cost. I stared at the back of Travis's head, my heart a dull, heavy thud in my chest. The war was almost over, but the wreckage was everywhere. The jury did not look at us when they walked back into the room. That was the first sign. 4 hours of talking behind a closed door to decide if a man's soul was worth more than the dirt he walked on. The foreman stood up. His voice was a thin, tired rasp. Guilty, 9 times. The word hit the floor like a lead pipe over and over. 18 years in a maximum security facility. No parole for 12. Travis did not even flinch. He just stood there, a hollowed-out tree, waiting for the axe. The bailiff stepped up. Click, click. The sound of chrome cuffs locking behind his back was the only funeral song Travis Brooks was ever going to get. He walked through that side door and became a number. The Saint of Millbrook was buried in a denim jumpsuit. The price of a lie always comes with interest. The bank did not care about the Brooks legacy or the local fame. They only cared about the math. Brooks & Sons was foreclosed on 48 hours after the sentencing. I watched a video someone posted online of the sign coming down. The rusted iron chains groaned as the crane lifted the name away from the siding. 3 years later, the grease stains on the floor were scrubbed away with industrial acid. The smell of oil and diesel was replaced by the scent of lavender and antiseptic. A physical therapy clinic moved in. They put up glass walls where the tool racks used to be. They turned a place of hidden trauma into a place of visible healing. The irony was a jagged pill that I swallowed every time I thought about that town. Gerald lost the house on Maple Ridge. The white picket fence he spent 20 years painting was sold to a young couple from the city who had no idea what had happened in the garage. My father moved into a 1-bedroom studio apartment above a laundromat downtown. The air there always smelled like stale detergent and damp basement. He spent his nights sitting in a moth-eaten recliner, staring at a television that only got 3 channels. He ate vegetable soup out of a tin can, the metallic scrape of his spoon against the bottom of the tin, the only conversation he had. He had chosen his son over his daughter, and now he was reaping a harvest of silence. He was 70 years old, and he was finally truly alone. Diane took the hardest hit. She was a pariah in a town that used to fear her. People stopped nodding to her at the grocery store. The church pews emptied out whenever she sat down. Gerald stopped talking to her completely, his own shame acting as a wall she could not climb. Even Aunt Linda, the woman who had lived in her shadow for 40 years, finally cut the cord. Diane packed what was left of her life into 6 cardboard boxes and an old sedan. She fled to a distant relative in Scranton, a cousin who did not read the Dutchess County papers. She lived in a spare room that smelled like old cat litter and damp wood. The woman who sold her daughter for $2,400 was now living on Social Security and the pity of strangers. She had protected the family name until there was no one left to call it. 1 week after the courthouse doors closed, my phone buzzed. It was an evening in Delmar, the sun dipping below the trees and casting long blue shadows across the yard. Paige. The call lasted exactly 6 minutes. There were no tears this time, no screaming. Words like sorry were too small to fix a 12-year-old wound, so she did not even try to say them. She sounded exhausted, like someone who had just finished a marathon through a minefield. "I signed up for the sessions," she said. Her voice was flat, echoing through the speaker. "The trauma specialist in Poughkeepsie. I start on Monday." I gripped the phone, my knuckles turning white. I looked out at Marcus and Lily on the porch. I felt the ghost of that red scarf around my hand. Good, I replied. That was it. I did not invite her for Thanksgiving. I did not tell her I loved her. The boundary I'd built out of military discipline and cold hard facts was still there. I was not ready to be a sister again, and maybe I never would be. But the poison was out of the system. The infection had been lanced. Faith, she whispered before hanging up. Yeah. I kept the boxes, she said. The ones you sent. I opened them. I closed my eyes and listened to the hum of the line. The items I had sent years ago, the birthday gifts, the letters, the proof that I was still alive, had finally been received. It did not fix the past, but it meant the silence was officially broken. I have to go, Paige, I said. I tapped the screen and ended the call. I walked to the window and watched the sky turn from orange to a deep, bruising purple. The Brooks Empire was nothing but ash and bone now. Millbrook was a map I had finally folded up and put in a drawer. The weight in my chest, the one I had carried since I was 27 years old, felt lighter. I went to the front door and turned the deadbolt. I checked it twice, a habit I would probably never lose. Then I walked into the living room and sat down with my real family. The war was over. The casualties were counted. I picked up Lily and felt her small, steady heartbeat against mine. It was the only rhythm that mattered now. But as the house went dark, I thought about the one thing I still had to do, the final mission. I reached into my bag and pulled out the old photo of me and Megan on the porch. I struck a match. I drank my coffee black. 6 a.m. The kitchen in Delmar's quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the soft rhythmic breathing of Lily in the nursery. The sun is just starting to cut through the gray mist outside the window, hitting the granite counter in long, pale streaks. It is a clean light. It doesn't smell like oil, old grease, or the suffocating scent of stale peppermint candy. I never went back to Millbrook. Not for the foreclosure auction. Not when the Brooks and Sons sign was hauled off to a scrapyard. I didn't need to see the carcass of the house on Maple Ridge to know the ghosts were gone. I folded grandmother's red wool scarf into a perfect 6-inch square military style and tucked it into a cedar box in the attic. It isn't a bandage anymore. It is just a piece of fabric. My life is built on different metrics now. I am Captain Faith Diaz. I am a wife. I am a mother who doesn't look for monsters in the garage, but the discipline stays. I still check the deadbolt twice before I go to bed. I still scan every room for the exits. You don't spend 12 years in a war zone, whether it's overseas or in your own childhood home, and come out with a soft edge. On the corkboard in my home office, there is a graduation announcement. Megan. She finished her degree in social work last May. She's working for the state now, helping kids who have the same hollow look in their eyes that she used to have. There was a card tucked inside the announcement. No long letters, no whirlwinds of emotion. Just one sentence written in her steady adult hand. Thank you for clearing the path. I look at that card every morning. It is the only medal I actually care about. Last month, I was invited to speak at a military psychology seminar in Poughkeepsie. The room was full of officers, analysts, and people who deal in the wreckage of human behavior. During the Q&A, a young lieutenant stood up. He looked at my file, then at me, his eyes questioning the coldness in my posture. Captain, he asked, his voice echoing in the hall. Do you ever regret it? Taking down your own family, pulling the pin on your own house? I didn't hesitate. I didn't look down. I took a sip of water, the glass steady in my hand, and looked him straight in the eye. I didn't pull a pin, Lieutenant, I said. The house was already full of gas. I just turned on the lights so people could see where the leak was coming from. I don't regret a single second of the truth. My only regret is that 7 girls had to live in the dark for 12 years because they were taught that silence was a form of loyalty. The room went silent. The kind of silence that happens when you speak a truth so raw it strips the paint off the walls. I don't hate Diane anymore. Hate takes energy, and I need mine for Lily and Marcus. I just feel a dull, distant pity. She chose $2,400 and a garage sign over her daughters. She chose a monster over the truth. Now she is living in a spare room in Scranton, staring at the walls, wondering why the world forgot her name. She saved her family until there was no family left to save. In the army, we take an oath. We swear to protect against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Most people think domestic means someone on the other side of a political line. I know better. Sometimes the domestic enemy is the woman who cooked your breakfast. Sometimes it is the brother who shared your dinner. Silence isn't loyalty. It is complicity. It is a crime committed in slow motion. I'd rather stand alone on the front line of the truth, catching every stone they throw, than sit at a crowded dinner table built on lies. I'd rather be the traitor who saved 7 lives than the good daughter who helped bury them. The sun is fully up now. The fog has burned off the driveway. Marcus walks into the kitchen, his hair messy, smelling like sleep and safety. He puts his hand on my shoulder, his thumb rubbing a small circle against the fabric of my shirt. He doesn't say anything. He doesn't have to. I hear Lily giggle in her crib, a bright, sharp sound that cuts through the house like a bell. That is the sound of a cycle breaking. That is the sound of a war finally being won. 7 voices, 1 truth. The mission is officially accomplished. The truth always wins out in the end, no matter how long it stays buried. Thanks for tuning into this case file on Noble Revenge. If Captain Faith Diaz's story gave you the grit to break the silence in your own life, drop a comment and hit that subscribe button. Catch you on the next battlefield.